Presentation will be given by Philip Owen. Thank you, Philip, for joining us. I will just introduce you to the audience. Philip Owen is a founding member of an Environmental Pressure Group GeaSphere. I don't know if I'm saying it right, Philip.
You're saying it right. Perfect.
Okay, thank you. His work is about raising awareness regarding the environmental and social impacts of large-scale industrial timber plantations, whilst advocating for a change towards diversified forestry models. GeaSphere is one of the founding organizations of the South African Water Caucus, a network of civil society organizations involved in the South African water sector. GeaSphere is also a member of networks such as the local TimberWatch Coalition and the Global Forest Coalition. We welcome you to our special webinar on climate justice, Philip. Thank you for making time. I will hand over to Andres, who is going to facilitate the discussion, and you also give us the ground rules of this webinar. Andres, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Philip, once again, welcome to the Center for Civil Society and to everyone else that has joined us. As Danford has mentioned, this is a special webinar series on climate justice, and I'm Andres Motawe, and I'll be facilitating. Just simple house rules for everyone else that has joined us. Please make sure that your mics are muted and your videos are off. We're going to give Philip around 30 to 40 minutes to do a presentation. Then after, we'll have a question and answer session. For those that have pressing questions, they can type them in the chat bar or alternatively raise their hands and we will acknowledge them towards the end. Philip, over to you.
Yeah, well, thanks, Andres. Thanks a lot to both of you and to the Center for Civil Society for inviting me to present on this issue, which is something that I've been involved with for I suppose most of my life. I represent this organization called GeaSphere, which is an environmental pressure group, as you correctly mentioned. It was started back in 1999 when I organized a meeting in Nelspruit, which went under the heading South African Water Crisis. And it was to discuss the impacts of industrial timber plantations on our area. From that meeting, I was mandated to form a kind of a network, and that was where our organization was then formed. We formally registered as GeaSphere in 2003. Yeah, and since then we've been involved in a couple of projects, which some of them we will discuss as we go through this presentation. I thought of sort of dividing the presentation into these three parts. Personal environmental consciousness. I would like to explain how I became involved in this issue of timber plantations and why it has become such a part of my life. I also want to then focus on timber plantations. Obviously, some trees are definitely not green, and we'll discuss some issues around that. And then one of the, well, in my view, one of the tools of solutions are this organization GeaSphere, which I've represented to varying degrees of success during the past years. Personal environmental consciousness. The bird that you see, it's called a darter, an African darter, sometimes called a snake bird. Dives in the water and it catches fish, but it can remain underwater for quite some time. And when they swim, sometimes they swim with only their heads protruding, you know, and then it looks like a snake swimming through the water. There's close to where I live, there's one of these big round cement dams. It's been there for many, many years. And on one occasion, I came up to the dam to check on the water level, and as I came up to the dam, one of these birds came out of the water. We had fish in the dam at the time, and it sat on the opposite side of this reservoir. I've never seen one of them, but it was amazing to see this quite a big adult bird. And then when I noted around its legs, there were bundles and bundles of fishing wire. And I mean, to me, it was clear then that we as peoples have a major impact on the environment, because this fish, of course, it hunts for this bird, it hunts for fish in the local environment, in the rivers, in the dams, in the streams. And even though it seems like a sort of natural area, you still find this predicament where plastic pollution affects a bird such as this to such a degree. I'm sure it was heavily compromised because there was a lot of this plastic fishing wire on its legs. There was a big acacia thorn tree on the other side of the dam, and I sort of thought that if I sneaked around the dam and scared it, it would fly up into the tree and maybe get hooked. And then I could try and catch it to try and remove the stuff. And in a way, it did happen that way, because I did scare it. It did fly up into this tree, and it did become stuck. But as it was struggling, those strands of fishing wire started breaking loose, and then it managed to fly off. But no, in a way, I was disappointed that I couldn't catch it to make sure that all of the stuff was removed. But I think, I mean, I was young at the time, and I think it really instilled in me this sense that, yeah, we're in shit, we're in trouble from an environmental perspective. And of course, we people need the environment. It's not as if we can live without it. We need it. It gives us all the stuff that we desperately need for life. Another thing that happened, there was this grassland which I frequented. Obviously, I often went up there on the mountain, high up on the mountain, walk there, small patch of grassland, because there's a lot of plantations in the area. But that was a relatively big grassland area, maybe 100 hectares. It's becoming very rare, and especially in this area. Anyways, one day I was walking there and I saw that, much of it was planted to timber, pine trees. And subsequent visits, every time I came there, the pine trees were taller and the grassland was thinning out. There was this one kind of plant, it's called the matakwan. Normally it creeps along the soil, but totally out of character. It was trying to lift itself to strain for the diminishing light. Because of course, as the trees were growing, the canopy was closing and there was less light coming through, and less, grassland plants need sunlight. So, it was a kind of futile battle, because I knew that, there was no chance for those plants. And somehow it felt very unfair and very stupid. Inside a grassland, there's apparently there's 4,000 different kinds of indigenous plants in the grassland. So to substitute 4,000 plants for one crop on such a scale, I just think, I know that we have, and we are still making a big mistake. Just a little bit about grasslands. The picture on the top left, of course, South Africa, and where most of the grasslands have been or are. Most of that area has been under the plow, and of course a large percentage we'll see later in a map how many and where the timber plantations are. Then you can just keep that map there in mind. Grassland is the world's most threatened vegetation type. More than 80% destroyed, less than 2% protected. Grassland is incredibly biodiverse because, of course, plants create habitat for other components of the ecosystem. So in terms of insects and small mammals and birds and reptiles, grasslands are incredibly biodiverse. Yeah, the bottom left picture shows a map of the world and where the main grassland areas are situated. Pampas in South America, the prairies in North America, the steppes in Russia, and of course the Southern African grasslands. In Australia, those grasslands are much drier. But yeah, most of these areas have been put under the plough. Grassland is threatened mainly due to industrial agriculture, but of course also due to urbanization. Much of the grassland, the whole of Gauteng, used to be a part of the grassland biome. Of course, open cast mining threatens the grassland, and bush encroachment threatens the grassland. And of course, that's involved with climate change, because as there's more carbon in the atmosphere, it's better conditions for trees to grow. And you can see everywhere in the grassland that indigenous trees are becoming rooted, becoming established, and in a way taking over. So the grassland is becoming less, and it's becoming more like a savanna sort of area with more trees. But unfortunately, that's a net decrease in biodiversity. And of course, diversity is one of the keys to life. Yeah, most of these grasslands in this region, the Mpumalanga escarpment, going through Swaziland, going through KwaZulu-Natal, going through the Eastern Cape, and up into Limpopo as well, where there's enough rainfall, more than 650 millimeters annual rainfall, because that's minimum what these plantations need. Industrial timber plantations have been established. So what's wrong with growing trees? Of course, we've discussed a little bit about how plantations impact on biodiversity. Underneath these timber plantations, there's very little that grows, and of course they become established. They harvested. Every trees like these or pine trees can be on longer cycles, some 25 years even, and then there's more biodiversity that becomes established. If you think about the so-called forests in Europe, most of those forests are also timber plantations. They are also monocultures, because of course a lot of the timber in the north, the natural forests, have already been utilized. So a lot of the trees they are replanted, and mostly monocultures. But in the north, the trees grow much slower. Maybe the rotations are 80 or 100 years or even more. And then there's more time for diversity to become established. So you would find, some trees would die. There'll be some sun patches. There'll be some berries. There'll be some deer. So because of those longer rotation cycles, there's more diversity. But here in the south, where these trees grow very quickly, rotations are faster, and of course that's less opportunity for biodiversity to become established, even though it would be completely changed. Some of the animals that's on the brink of extinction, the blue swallow on the left. It lives in these high altitude moist grasslands, which are now mainly timber plantations, or primarily timber plantations. So their habitat has been vastly changed. Top right is Rudd's lark. Apparently that's South Africa's most threatened bird species. And at the bottom right is the oribi, South Africa's most threatened antelope species. And also all of these animals are dependent on these high altitude moist grasslands, which is their prime habitat. Baboons have become quite an issue in timber plantations. They are very adaptable, and they've started chewing at the timber at some of the pine trees. So they chew at the bark. They're not sure what nutrients they get out of it, but they damage the trees, and of course that leads to financial losses for the timber industry. And this is something that's been happening since the 70s, where this problem has been identified. And the current management method is to entrap baboons in huge numbers. It's definitely more than 6,000 baboons that's been culled in this way. But the problem is actually intensifying. It's not decreasing. They would think that having removed over the last couple of decades more than 6,000 baboons, I think that the problem would be alleviated. But yeah, you mess with the troop dynamics, because it's not possible to entrap an entire troop, whole entire troop. So you know, there's a hierarchy in a baboon troop, and when that hierarchy becomes disturbed, then of course there can be younger males that mates with older females, and there can be explosion in a population. And not that we see an explosion in a population here. Of course, the other problem is that there's less natural food source for the wild baboons, and most of the damage actually occurs, as I understood it, where baboons move from one natural area to another natural area. That's where most of these damaged plantation compartments exist. There was an industry baboon damage working group that was established, where there was open participation. Anyone could participate, and we did participate, and we did try to show up the alternatives to culling. For example, opening up larger corridors between timber plantations, natural areas, even do some land restoration and establish some you know, kinds of plants and trees and berries that baboons would naturally eat, and try and correct some of the massive imbalances that's occurred. But you know, the timber industry, they must see themselves as the forest industry. It's a forest. They've got a very green image, and but I don't think they are willing or easily willing to go this kind of green, because they should have very wide corridors, at least 200 meters broad, through these timber plantations. 200 meters. It's interesting. There were some studies in I think from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where it was determined that a corridor, through a natural corridor that runs through a plantation, should be at least 200 meters wide. Otherwise, animals don't stay in that corridor, or they just move through it, because it's a threat if the corridor is not wide enough. If it's wider, like 200 meters, then they actually would spend a bit of time in the corridor, pollinate some of the indigenous plants that might remain there. Anyways, baboons is one of the threats to the timber industry, but I think the timber industry is much more of a threat to the baboons. Also, of course, that we don't know exactly what the ecological value. We know that baboons have ecological value, that there's some kinds of plants, for example, that the seeds have to will only germinate once they've passed through the guts of the baboon. A friend of mine, rest in peace, old Wally Mena, he used to collect baboon droppings, dry baboon droppings, so that he could germinate the seeds that he would find in it, because of course all those plants would be edible to us humans. Yeah, also impacts on biodiversity. This is a crocodile in Kruger National Park. You can see how emancipated it is. Of course, it was very dry during those times. When it's drier, there's even more of a problem with regards to water availability. Timber plantations consume a lot of water. We're going to be discussing that just now. But yeah, as there's less water, the water becomes more polluted because there's less dilution potential. Fish becomes contaminated, and crocodiles can die due to eating contaminated fish. We live in a complex, integrated web of life, and we've unfortunately we've damaged so much of it that it will be difficult, but not impossible, to recuperate. Another impact, of course, and one of the main impacts, I would say, is the impact on water, because water is life. Nothing can happen without fresh drinking water. There was just this article about residents in Barberton that were protesting and shutting down the town, basically because of lack of water. There's no water there. Main catchment of the Barberton Dam, the Highlands Dam, planted to timber and recently converted to eucalyptus, which uses more water, which is something that we'll discuss soon. But yeah, again, these issues are linked: water protests and catchments mismanagement. This is a very interesting graph. It's from the flora of the Mariepskop. Just shows how the water levels were affected in the Glacieri River. So you can see there, 1935 to 1940, there was 143 million cubic liters of water that came down there, down the Glacieri River. And then you can see how it's changed 1961 to 64. Okay, it's a few years less, but 16.56 million cubic meters of water, or liters of water. So it's just an incredible drop in volume. And you can see that the rainfall remains more or less the same. The only change is the establishment of timber plantations in the catchment areas. It's the only change in the catchment of the Glacieri River. And it's had such an incredible impact on the water resource. Now there you can just see where timber plantations have been established. It's all along the so-called mist belt, the change from the high veld to the low veld in this escarpment area, where of course there's more rainfall, because that correlates very well with the highest rainfall areas in the country. That's where timber plantations have been established, because of course they consume a tremendous amount of water. Pine trees, 50 liters a day easily. Eucalyptus trees, 100 liters, up to 1,000 liters. If you don't believe me, you can look at a video on our YouTube channel, interview with a scientist, and it's absolutely confirmed how much water timber plantations can consume. It's a lot. The impacts on soil. I mean, this is a picture that was taken by Mr. Wally Mena, not far from here, just after a harvest or a clear cut. You can see how the slopes of this mountain used to be plantation, used to be grassland. Then the grassland was replaced by plantations, and of course now this is part of the cycle of the clear cutting. And of course this leads to a tremendous amount of soil erosion, because there's no plants that can hold the soil back. Sometimes they would burn the slash, which slash is the branches and stuff that's left over, and that would sometimes make the problem even worse, because the soil becomes baked, and that increases the hydrophobicity, where water doesn't penetrate but just slip over, and you find massive amounts of soil erosion, and that leads, of course, to higher turbidity in the local river systems. Local rivers are in big trouble with regards to the water, aquatic insects and fishes, and they are much fewer now. Many of them cannot live in these high turbidity, dirtier waters that we frequently experience now. Impacts on rural communities, of course, impact on water security. There's these timber plantation industries here in Mpumalanga. Timber industry is a stream flow reduction activity. So you have to have a license to be able to establish timber plantation. And there's no more licenses for water licenses to be issued. We are oversubscribed here in Mpumalanga with regards to timber plantations. So there's still some water to be allocated in northern KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape. And that's where the timber industry is promoting these outgrowing schemes, where they get local communities to invest in timber plantations on a small scale. They supply the trees, they supply certain services, and then they buy the trees when they are mature. So it's a way for communities to benefit financially, but at what cost? I understand that from 1 hectare of timber plantations, you can expect to make about 1,500 rand per year. 1 hectare, 1,500 rand per year. So obviously you need hundreds of hectares if you really want to make big money. So on a smaller scale, communities are busy with these outgrowing schemes. And of course, many small plantations eventually becomes one large plantation and very difficult to manage. What they don't tell the communities when they promote these plantations is that they will lose out on their water security. They won't have much grazing land anymore. And of course, they will lose access to natural resources, thatching grass, edibles, fruits and nuts, wild animals that you normally would find in nature. There's a diminished capacity for small-scale diversified farming, value adding, and a loss of sense of space and a loss of culture and a loss of traditions, because many of the local African traditions are connected to nature, and it seems as if that is being forgotten. Okay, let's move on. Yeah, you can see a sign. This is a plantations being established in Uganda. Where there's even a sign that says, "Hey guys, sorry, no grazing." We've been advocating for alternative forestry models, models that's based on diversified, diversity on all levels, within the timber plantation compartments and wider. The use of indigenous trees. Spoke to a guy from, where was it? From South America somewhere, where he was saying that in his country, there's 600 indigenous timber species, but they only use 2 exotic timber species. So we have to look at here in South Africa as well, in yellowwood trees, African mahoganies. There's many trees that grows relatively fast. And of course, even though it grows on longer cycles, there's a much, much higher value timber associated. Use of animals in agriculture. Close to where I live, there's still one team that's employed in a state-owned plantation, team of horses and mules. So where some of the timber extraction is still being done by horses and mules. And of course, that's positive from an environmental perspective and from a social perspective, as it provides more job opportunities, less compaction, less use of fossil fuels, a little bit more diversity. And around it, there's also a sort of industry that can develop if it's used on a broader scale. Full use of the understory. I mean, at the moment, we just use one level of the timber plantation. They just use the one level. And in a real forest, there's multiple levels. So the understory under the trees should also be developed. One can plant herbs, one can plant food crops, one can develop animal husbandry. There must be some form of diversification. One should manage for maximum water retention in all current timber plantations. And at the moment, like we've mentioned before, due to the management practice of burning slash, there's more soil erosion because there's less water retention. That should change. Right, and then yeah, maximum land restoration. That's something that because I mean, I like this theory, the half-earth theory, where they say that 50% of the available land should go to nature, and that's not really for nature's sake; it's for the people's sake, because of course people depend upon the natural services. We cannot live without nature, but at the moment we're snuffing it. And one of the ways that we think we should move towards is putting pressure on the state-owned timber plantations, which I understand is not really financially viable. That they should be pressure on them to diversify and to plant indigenous and to restore the land and to employ people to do land restoration projects. But yeah, in the way, of course, is the massive pulp mills like this one, Sapinamodwana pulp mill. These are the monsters which have been established at billions of rands and huge investments. And of course, once they've become established, they need to be fed. And of course, that is a part of that is the problem. Cellulose. There's, in the old days, I can just go back to this picture, mills like this was primarily producing pulp for paper, like the Nongodwana pulp mill. And for producing pulp and paper, they required primarily fiber from pine trees. So for cellulose, they need eucalyptus fiber. And unfortunately, there's been a drop in paper consumption globally, but there's been a massive increase in cellulose. And of course, the timber plantation, the industry is responding by producing cellulose, a lot of it being exported to the east. Like mentioned, for cellulose production, you need eucalyptus fiber. So some of the timber plantation compartments in the area that used to be pine are now being converted to eucalyptus plantations. They're being converted one-on-one. So if 100 hectares of pines are removed or harvested, 100 hectares of eucalyptus goes in. It used to be so that there was this stream flow reduction licensing application advisory committee meeting where many different stakeholders got together. It was organized by the Department of Water, Affairs and Forestry at the time, and it went through to the Department of Water Affairs and Sanitation. But at the moment, it's not functional because there's no more licenses being issued here in Mpumalanga. But you could convert pines to eucalypts or eucalypts to pines, but it has to go through this licensing committee, and because you're licensed for a certain amount of water, and eucalyptus uses more water than pine, 35% plus. So it used to be that if you convert from pine to eucalypts, you have to establish 35% less land area and manage the land that you're not planting for maximum water infiltration. But that's not what Forestry South Africa has been promoting to their clients. They've been saying, no, you can plant one-on-one. And one of their reasons are, they say pines and eucalypts use the same amount of water over time. And that is something that we definitely do not agree with. It's quite a big problem currently. In fact, last year I got a letter from the head of Forestry South Africa, where they threatened to take me to court and claim damages due to me harming the reputation of the companies involved. They said, no, eucalyptus and pine use the same amount of water. And of course, I couldn't retract my words. But fortunately, they haven't taken me to court yet. Yeah, sure. On the right, top right is Mr. S.V. Engelbrecht. He was one of the guys that's behind the cellulose expansion. And he's retired now, but I do feel that, you know, because there was a time that they have these community meetings at the mall, environmental liaison kind of meetings, and we used to attend it as GeaSphere up until the time that we basically we wanted to discuss this exact issue, the issue of plantation of eucalypts using more water than pine. That was back in 2016, and this Mr. S.W. Engelbrecht, he was the manager of the mill at the time. He just flatly refused that issue be discussed at that meeting, and to me that was disappointing, because obviously now it's led to a lot of big problems at the moment. The timber industry, forestry South Africa, and the government, Department of Water Affairs, is in court to decide this issue on whether it is legal for them to just convert in the first place and then convert one-on-one. Of course, SAPI is one of the South African paper and pulp industry. That's one of the biggest players in the South African plantation sector. Bottom left is the cellulose picture of the cellulose factory, and then forestry South Africa, of course. That's the umbrella body for most of the plantations growers in South Africa. All right. There's a growing trend to burn biomass for renewable energy. Of course, I've heard that 70% of the global renewable energy is actually just the burning of wood, the burning of biomass. It's hugely problematic because it leads to more plantations being established, plantations with all of these massive impacts that some of them that we've discussed. But that these plantations are planted, and even more intensely, because plantations for biomass, they plant the trees closer together and they are harvested even on a faster rotation. So it's a very, very extractive process. It's not, I can say, yeah, but it's renewable because the trees grow again. You can burn the tree very, very quickly, but it takes a long time for the trees to grow. So there's that gap. And of course, with the amount of pollution that it generates, and the impacts where the trees are grown, it's just not a good idea. Yeah, there's some current issues like in Namibia, where there's a big project to use Namibian bush wood to then burn in power stations in Germany. And this bush is from so-called invader bush, you know, from bush encroachment, because as previously mentioned, there's a lot of woody vegetation that's becoming established in especially grassland areas. But yeah, not so green. Another not so green is the FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council. I was surprised when I learned that 80% of South Africa's industrial timber plantations are actually certified as responsibly managed forests by the Forest Stewardship Council. I mean, in the first place, it is definitely, plantation is not a forest, because when you think of a forest, you think of many, many different kinds of trees and plants and animals live in the forest. These are massive monocultures. So how can they be FSC certified? We've had many arguments about and with the FSC, and some say that the FSC certified plantation is better managed than a non-FSC certified plantation, and that might well be true. But in our view, it is not the management of the plantation which is really problematic. It's the model of the plantation. They call it the Swedish model, you know, these monocultures of alien timber species. Forest Stewardship Council. Right. I want to talk a little bit about GeaSphere, because as I've mentioned, this is one of the tools that we've been using over the years to create awareness. Yeah, we're part of different networks, and I put these for here, because there's some of those that through the years we've been always involved with. Of course, TimberWatch, network of organizations involved in timber issues, local network. Wally Menno, of course, at the moment is Brian Ash, that's the chairperson. Then the Global Forest Coalition, it's an international coalition of organizations involved in the forest sector. The South African Water Caucus, which is quite a broad coalition of organizations, local organizations involved in the water sector. Mailing list and regional, like the Mpumalanga Water Caucus, the KZN Water Caucus. So they've got regional actions, but they also get together on a national level. Good way to circulate information. Then also the Welthaus, Bielefeld. It's an organization in Germany whom we still participate with, and through whom we've received volunteers from Germany, young volunteers, which did during the time provide us with a lot of good capacity and nice young youthful energy, now doing their stuff all over the world. Organizations that supported us through the years, our very, very first small donation was from WESA, the Wildlife Environment Society of South Africa. 1999, they gave us 2,000 Rand, which we used to promptly print a lot of leaflets, which we then disseminated in the area. Global Forest Coalition have always been a valuable partner of GeaSphere, and through them we've been able to partake in various projects such as the Community Conservation Resilience Initiative, which we might discuss a little bit more. Cementpo, let me just go back, Cementpo. We've got the Engagement Global from Germany. We've got SSNC, which used to be our main funding partner from 2005 to 2013. And then the Global Green Grants Fund, who gave us our very, very first small green grant, which we used to organize a big meeting in Nelspruit, 2003. These are some of the German volunteers that we have. This the first two German volunteers, Tim Struppert and Isabel Jacob, but we've had 10 volunteers through the years. Community Conservation Resilience Initiative, some of the projects which we've been involved with through the Global Forest Coalition, which was really insightful to me, providing the opportunity to go to deep rural areas. And what was most interesting was the FPIC processes, the free prior informed consent. It's really something that's critical in working in communities of any kind, because people want to be informed and they want to be able to provide consent with regards to issues which impact on themselves. This is me at the also Global Forest Coalition meeting that they had in 2015, which coincided with the World Forestry Conference, which took place here in Durban. It was 2015. Other issues that we're involved with, nappies, which is also a big problem in KZN, but a huge problem in Mpumalanga, that grew out of this Community Conservation Resilience Initiative. One of the main issues which rural communities were struggling with was discarded nappies, disposable nappies, which is just discarded in the water, in the rivers and the streams. Several projects trying to clean up these nappies, but really we tried to connect with Kimberly Clark and Procter & Gamble, those guys that make billions out of these nappies. They've got the power to distribute these products in the rural communities, deepest rural communities. They should also take better care of their products. Yeah, but it did even a great article in the Huffington Post where GeaSphere and some of our work there is mentioned. I'm almost finished. I think that it's important to create awareness, to build capacity, and to change our lifestyles. One of the ways in which we are still working on creating awareness is these GeaSphere Earth Matter conversations, which we have almost on a weekly basis. where we talk with different colleagues, like December Ndlovu, there top left, Dale McKinley, Mariette Liefering, Andrew, David van Wyk. There's just these interviews with some of the top, South Africa's top civil society activists, and some of really some interesting conversations there. So they're all available on our YouTube channel. So if you are interested, please, you should go and listen to some of them are a bit long, like more than 2 hours. I think David van Wyk was 2.5 hours, but yeah, all interesting stuff. This is the Mpumalanga Environmental Youth Network. After one of our meetings, this is a project through Engagement Global that we were involved with, and a very valuable project where youth got together, and there was a strong series of capacity building meetings and workshops, which I think was very fruitful, because it's never bad to invest in the youth. Small scale charcoal. One of the things that we got involved with during the COVID times, when there was a serious lockdown at our business, we couldn't operate our normal business, and then we started a small scale charcoal production using wood that we've removed from grassland areas. So it's like a land restoration project from which we made charcoal. Charcoal is great because you can use it for cooking and for energy. On a small scale, of course, you can utilize it to make biochar for soil vitality by using good composts. We made a great charcoal cooler. Anyone wants to Google that, just Google charcoal cooler. It's just amazing what you can do with charcoal and how much energy can be saved by using technology such, basically just a box with sides made of charcoal, which you wet, and it becomes like a super cooler. You can keep your cheese and your milk and whatever you have that you want to keep cool there. We made a compost water heater. We also present workshops on doing this kind of stuff, but from compost, you can actually get heat, 65 degrees, hot water, which remains hot in a good compost for more than a month. Yeah, and then small scale wood gasifying, which I think we don't really have time for discussing now, but wood gasifying on a small scale is a great way to produce decentralized energy. But it has to be small scale, because large scale gasifying projects, of course, also leads to the development of huge timber plantations. Yeah, renewable energy is something that we are involved with from time to time. I don't know if anyone saw this movie, Planet of the Humans, by Michael Moore. Yeah, a very, very critical look at renewable energy, at solar and at wind. I mean, for solar, you still need the panels, they still need to be produced. There's still mining involved, lots of mining involved in the processes of producing these renewable energies, still reliant on batteries, and they're very, very expensive. So it's not something that at the moment is viable for communities. It's just too expensive. It's prohibitively expensive, and it's got its environmental costs. Yeah, something that I'm interested in is, and I know I mention it on some of these Earth Matters conversations, but it's nuclear energy. I don't think we should discount nuclear energy completely. I understand from one of the previous meetings in this series that 500 billion rand has already been spent on Eskom coal-fired power stations, you know, Kusile and Madupi. So 500 billion rand could have gone a long, long way in developing nuclear energy, but not conventional based on uranium, nuclear energy based on thorium. Thorium, radio, it's much less, the byproduct is much less radioactive. There's much less waste produced through in a thorium nuclear reactor. It cannot be weaponized, so there's no plutonium being produced. That's why they use uranium, because one of the byproducts is plutonium, which of course they've been using throughout the Cold War in the bombs, where thorium cannot be weaponized to that degree. And thorium is quite abundant. And in fact, there's some that say these thorium nuclear reactors can run on waste from previous reactors. So you don't even have to mine thorium, which is something like 3 times more available than uranium. It's just interesting because you're not going to run an electric train from solar power. I doubt it very much. So thorium, of course, there's no carbon being emitted. And the main reason why people are concerned about nuclear, of course, is the waste. And thorium, much less waste, much less waste, and much less radioactive. I think within 500 years, it's completely broken down. So yeah, for those of you interested to look at, just Google thorium nuclear and see what you think. Just a last question. This is actually a title of a book by this guy, Bjorn Lomberg, how to spend $75 billion to make the world a better place. And he's an economist, and he looked at the World Millennium Goals and looked at all the different goals and which ones is really financially viable to try and do to make the world a better place. And the one thing they came up with is nutrition. Infant and youth, young people must eat better food. Of course, if you eat better food, you've got more capacity. Yeah, and if you've got more capacity, we can. They say if we lift people out of poverty, people start caring more about the environment. It's not they say, that's sort of logical. If people are not poor and have to worry about where they sleep and what they eat, they can worry about the environment, which gives them life. Yeah, and in order to achieve our best, we need to invest more in nutrition. But this guy, Bjorn Lomberg, of course, that's the skeptical environmentalist. So many things that we would probably not agree with. The last thing, I just want to talk a little bit about these 3 colleagues. I've met many people through the last couple of years involved in these struggles, and all of them have my greatest respect. These 3 colleagues are not here anymore. Passed away. Wally Mena, he was the chairperson of TimberWatch. Yeah, he was the biggest thorn in the side of the timber industry, locally and globally. He's had a big impact in the lives of many people. And I think if it wasn't for him, I also would not have been involved in the struggle to the degree that I was or am. Top right is Tabang Kuzela, used to work for the Environmental Monitoring Group, also passed away. Married to my colleague Velman Kosi. But yeah, Tabang was just such a good mentor, and it's really pity that he's not there anymore. And then bottom right is Wayne Lotter, a good friend of mine that was assassinated in Tanzania for the work that he's been doing to protect animals from poaching, elephants from poaching. And he was assassinated as he drove from the airport to his hotel. Yeah, he was responsible for having had some of the main ivory dealers and rhino horn dealers in Tanzania jailed and brought to account. Right, that's our Facebook page, facebook.com/GeaSphere and youtube.com/GeaSphere Africa, if any of you are interested in just checking out more of our work. That's our logo. I'm going to stop my screen share. That's it, Andries.
Thank you very much, Philip. It was really insightful and really great work that you've done over the years. I think we have a comment from Mariette Lefranc, and for those that do know Mariette, we have screened one of the documentaries where she was featured, which is called Josie Gold. She comments that we salute Philip for his sustained activisms, perhaps of relevance, according to the National Water and Sanitation Master Plan between 1999 and 2011. The extent of main rivers in South Africa classified as having poor ecological condition increased by 500%, with some rivers pushed beyond the point of recovery. South Africa has lost over 50% of its wetlands, and of the remaining 33% are in of poor ecological condition. As well, Mate, our colleague, she's asking that that you talked about how slashing and burning tree trunks cause soil breaking, which obviously causes extensive soil damage and erosion. Do they replant the trees? Do they replant the trees on the same area? How does that work? For they constantly look for new plantation areas. And I also got a question on the economic stability of South Africa. Don't you think that if it wasn't for the timber plantation, some of the socioeconomic challenges that we have of poverty, they would have become much more worse? What do we prioritize? Do we prioritize the economy for people to have jobs, or do we prioritize the environment? I think you should just answer those, the first two questions, and then I'll give you another set of questions, and then we'll close. I see we are out of time as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for the comments, Mariette, and for the questions. They do use the same area to replant. They have to remove the slash in some way, you know, the pieces of the trees that they don't use. So if they just leave them there, they present a fire hazard because they dry out, of course, and then they can burn uncontrolled. That's why they try to burn them in a controlled fashion. And there's also some timber companies, including SAPI, which have started using a way of chipping where the environment, the landscape allows it. They mulch those branches. They've got these big machines that chips the wood. They mulch it because they have to prevent fire damage. But yes, then they plant in those same areas. They have, in some areas, they have started using chemical fertilizers to just boost the trees in a young stage. And of course, then with eucalyptus trees, they go for several rotations where they just coppice. So you just harvest the tree and then they grow out again from the root stem, which is still there. But with pine trees, you have to plant them from a young little tree. With regards to timber plantations and economics, I would say that I don't think all the costs have been quantified. And if I think about this area, say 70, 80, 90, 100 years ago, it used to be very, very much diversified from a farming perspective. Fruit farmers, vegetable farmers, dairy farmers, people that were making cheese, people that were producing milk, sheep farmers that were moving up and down from the high veld to the low veld, vegetable farmers, so maize farmers. So in that diversity, there's a lot more employment opportunity. There's a lot in that diversity. There's a lot more resilience in the landscape than to have these massive monocultures. Then you also have to remember that most of these plantations, they do not present lots of employment opportunities because they've heavily invested in mechanization. So you have tools, machines that does the works or the work of thousands of people. So it's not as if the timber industry is supplying that many jobs, especially if you contrast it to what was, what could have been, and of course, what could still be into the future. Because again, from a sustainability point of view, we have to diversify. We cannot plant successive monocultures because this scientist, Bram van Wyk, He's one of South Africa's foremost scientists or academics on the grassland biome. He equates a timber plantation to a mine. He actually says it's worse than a mine, because of course as the trees grow they use the soil nutrients, and in the long term the soil nutrients can be depleted. And what he said was that you can try and rehabilitate an open cast mine, but it's very difficult to rehabilitate a plantation. So plantations, of course, it's all part of an extractive industry. Also at the moment, I mean, there's many people that are dependent on the natural environment for their livelihoods. So if they see their nature, like in Mozambique, for example, many people dependent on the mashambas doing their small-scale agriculture. If the environment is being changed to such a degree as it's being changed at the moment, here in South Africa, many areas have already been changed like that. But in places like Mozambique, it's happening at the moment, where people losing out on their way of living, and their way of living was resilient. Didn't maybe bring in thousands of rands, but you had resilience, you had your community safety net, you had your wilderness, the capacity that you got from that, the resources that you could obtain. If you lose that, you lose a lot. Also, you lose out on your traditions, you lose out on your culture, and even your way to practice those. There's things that you cannot measure in terms of money alone. And just to add that I've mentioned before that from 1 hectare of timber plantations, you can expect to make 1,500 rand per year. From 1 hectare of diversified organic farming, you can make more than 30,000 rand per year. So that's a huge difference. And organic, diversified, zero waste farming is what people are used to. That's what people do. To have some bokke, you know, some sheep, maybe some cattle, some maize, some guavas, some, you know, diversity, some chickens. Diversity again brings and breeds resilience. Again, I don't think all the costs have been quantified, and I think the timber industry is costing us, even on an economic way, more than what we are making.
Just to add on to that, we are a very scarce water resource country, and water drives most economic activities in South Africa. As well, when you speak of diversification, I mean, when you look at what has happened in Knysna fires, I mean, the timber industry really suffered. Imagine if there was diversification. Obviously, people will have other options for livelihoods. And this brings me to the next question. And do these forest companies have any measures to reduce the damage in the soils and the natural ecosystem? And then as well, they are asking if, with your activism, is there any form of collaboration with those companies? Have you tried reaching out to them and then speaking to them about those impacts that they are having on the environment and communities? As well, what is the South Africa's government stance on those? Are they aware of what's going on? How are they reacting to those?
No, I can say that definitely we do work with industry. We do engage, we don't work with them, but we engage industry. We've engaged them on several platforms, some of their own making, like the Forests Environmental Liaison Forum, where we communicated and where we were able to exchange views. The Baboon Damage Working Group, where we regularly got together, and the Nombadwana Environmental Liaison Committee, where we also regularly got together. At the moment, we interact like through the IUCMA, the Nkomati Usutu Catchment Management Agency, which is a part of the government Water Affairs and Sanitation Department. So IUCMA is like a government arm of government, and we work with them. And we at the moment we are working, we are on the same side with regards to the struggle of changing from pine trees to eucalyptus trees, because that in our region can have major impact. We don't have enough water here. Just before this last, thankfully, good rainy season, our rivers here were almost completely dry. We cannot afford heavier water users in the catchment. And at the moment, that's what's happening, you know. So the government agrees with us and say, hey, forestry is important, but it's not more important than other water users in the system. Unfortunately, you find that forestry or timber plantations are in the upper catchments, where they have first access to the water resource. That's where the rain falls. That's where the rain gets collected. And of course, when you don't, you can't just cut off, you can't just stop the timber plantations from utilizing water. Irrigation farmers lower down in the system, the government can tell them and say, hey, it's too dry now, sorry, we have to use the water for the people, you can't irrigate your crops. But with timber plantations, you cannot do that. You cannot just simply turn off the tap. With regards to the question about what the timber industry, of course, they have to be concerned about their impacts. But I think they are, like most industry, primarily concerned about their profits. So like with this issue of conversion from pines to eucalyptus, I'm sure that they must realize that there is some major drawbacks with regards to the rest of the community, which depend upon this environment and the water resource. But and I cannot accept that they simply don't care about the rest of the community. And by making decisions such as these, even though they've been asked on several occasions, I mean, that was this issue have been raised several times, also through formal processes like the environmental impact assessments, going back to 2003, when the first SAPI Nongedwana expansion project was announced and proposed, and then eventually followed through on. But we've been mentioning these issues, so the industry is well aware of these issues. And then, you know, at some stage you do assume that it doesn't look as if they care. Organizations like the Forest Stewardship Council, though we're critical of them, I mean, they are supposed to look at the environmental and social and financial sustainability of timber growers. So that is a method which the timber industry used to police themselves in a way, you know. But through the years, we've submitted several complaints to the FSC with regards to the baboons, for example. The baboons being culled in this measure, we say that they must consider alternative non-lethal methods first, and they must test and prove them well before they discard or dismiss them. And then now more recently with these conversions from pines to eucalypts, because that can have you know, the conversions can have a massive impact on our region within the next couple of years. We have to act now. In some ways, I feel, you know, that so much damage has already been done. And for us to get to the point of actually changing industrial timber plantations to a more diversified forestry system, that's still many decades away. But I have no doubt that it will happen. And it can either happen through us planning for it and cooperating and working towards this kind of change in the model, because it doesn't just concern the timber plantations, of course, it concerns the way that all of us live and all of us treat this planet. So it's a broader issue, you know, of consumerism. Which we are all, or many of us, all of us involved and complicit with to some degree. I mean, we all use our cell phones. We're not going to stop using them or stop using the train or our cars. You know, we are complicit in this system. So we have to look at ways of bettering it. Yeah, again, the timber industry must be concerned about their own sustainability. They argue and say that no, you know, they don't draw down the soil nutrients. They don't deplete soil nutrients. They say that's not a problem, but they are introducing more chemical fertilizers. And it is logical to know that diversity builds life, you know. So soil is only alive and nutritious because it's alive. The life in the soil is what makes it, you know, viable. And that life is being impacted upon, and that in the long term will definitely have an impact. So apart from water, the soil sustainability must be a factor which the timber industry consider. In the longer term, it's going to affect them.
Yeah, Philip, I'd really, you know, we can have a conversation for hours, but I see that we are over time. I'd like to thank you for the time that you've given us today and the great insight that you've given. I think one of the comments was that how do we collaborate, you know, on such work? And then obviously, if there are any other questions, we'll send them to you and any other thing. But then just maybe I'll give you 30 seconds just to tell us, how do we reach out to you in order to learn about this work or to participate about this work? Because then that's a question that keeps on coming up.
Oh, well, I mean, you can go to our Facebook page, because at the moment that's where we've added our newsworthy events. You can like our page, that's number one. Please also subscribe to our YouTube channel. But if you want to really connect and discuss some kind of common strategy, obviously we work with networks like TimberWatch Coalition based in Durban. But if somebody wants to contact me directly, p.r.owen@icloud.com. So yeah, that's it. p.r.owen@icloud.com. Please send me an email. I'll be happy to discuss any collaboration further. We are in projects like through the Global Green Grants Fund. We have a small project which is this. It also involves these Earth Matters conversations which we are having. Those are really nice because it's an opportunity for all of us to learn more from these grassroots activists. Mariette Liefering, for example, was one of the persons that's been interviewed, and she's just a wealth of information on mines and the impacts of gold mining specifically. So yeah, collaborate with through Global Forest Coalition, through the TimberWatch, and through the South African Water Caucus, which is also a great organization or network to become involved with. We can add you to their mailing list. So if anybody is also interested in joining the South African Water Caucus mailing list, please just send me an email and I'll add you. No, it doesn't flood your inbox, but occasionally there's interesting informations about you know, water sector issues. So that's it. I thank you.
So thank you very much, Philip, and thank you to everyone else that joined. I hope it was really interesting. We'll share the links to your Facebook and your YouTube to our mailing list, and obviously any other information. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.
Bye.